This morning in Cleveland, two words sent shockwaves through the entire NFL. I'm sorry. At first glance, it looked like a hard-fought apology. A head coach admitting he was wrong, standing face-to-face with his rookie quarterback. But insiders say this wasn't about honesty or even respect. It was about survival. Behind closed doors, ownership had just delivered an ultimatum. Sponsors were panicking, media pressure was boiling, and suddenly the same coach who'd been accused of sabotaging his quarterback for weeks flipped the script in a single moment. So, was this a genuine reconciliation or a forced surrender staged to save the franchise's reputation? Because what happened in that meeting might not only decide the future of the Cleveland Browns, but also change the way power works in the NFL forever. According to team insiders, Kevin Stefanski didn't just shake Sanders' hand and move on. He allegedly looked him straight in the eye and admitted, "I was wrong. I should have had your back." For a head coach who built his career on discipline, structure, and never showing weakness, those words were stunning. Teammates who witnessed the moment said the air in the locker room shifted instantly. The tension that had been weighing on the entire team for weeks seemed to evaporate, replaced by something almost unrecognizable in Cleveland: hope. But here's the part most people don't realize. That apology wasn't just a spontaneous outburst of guilt. Multiple reports claim it was carefully scripted, not for Sanders, not for the team, but for the cameras, the owners, and the sponsors watching closely. Because by the time Stefanski delivered those words, the Browns weren't just facing a quarterback controversy, they were facing a full-blown organizational crisis. And that raises the real question. If the apology wasn't authentic, then who was really pulling the strings? If you think Stefanski suddenly had a change of heart, think again. Reports suggest this apology didn't come from the locker room. It came straight from the top. According to multiple insiders, Browns owner Jimmy Haslam was furious. The endless headlines, the viral hashtags like Free Sanders and Fire Stefanski, the growing pressure from sponsors and season ticket holders, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was bad for business. The night before the apology, Haslam allegedly held an emergency conference call with minority owners. The message: enough is enough. The controversy was damaging the Browns' brand value, threatening partnerships and distracting from the season opener that was about to be broadcast nationwide. So Stefanski wasn't given a choice. Ownership reportedly delivered an ultimatum: reconcile with Sanders immediately or face the consequences. That's why what looked like a coach humbling himself in front of his quarterback was actually something else entirely. It was a corporate move, a forced reconciliation designed to protect the franchise's image, not to heal a fractured relationship.
And when you understand that, everything about the apology feels different. Because if ownership had to step in this aggressively, then the situation inside the Browns' locker room was even worse than anyone thought. But how did it spiral out of control so quickly? To see that, you have to rewind just a few weeks. To really understand how we got here, you have to look at the timeline, because this wasn't some slow-burning feud. It was a fast-moving storm that exploded in just 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, reports out of training camp were already raising eyebrows. Sanders was consistently outperforming Dillon Gabriel in practice, making highlight-level throws and commanding the offense. But when it came to first-team reps, Stefanski kept leaning toward Gabriel. Insiders described it as favoritism, and players noticed. 2 weeks ago, the preseason film made the divide impossible to ignore. Sanders delivered explosive plays in limited opportunities, while Gabriel's performances looked flat. Yet instead of giving Sanders a bigger role, coaches doubled down, keeping him on the sideline. The whispers of bias grew louder. Then last week, things hit another level. Anonymous leaks, allegedly from within the coaching staff, surfaced questioning Sanders' preparation, his maturity, even his ability to learn the system. To teammates, it felt like a smear campaign. And for a rookie trying to prove himself, the timing couldn't have been worse. By yesterday, the story had reached its breaking point. A prominent Browns insider reported the relationship between Stefanski and Sanders was irreparable. Headlines exploded, fans panicked, and the team seemed destined for another year of dysfunction before the season had even started. And then, this morning, everything flipped. Out of nowhere, the coach who'd been shutting Sanders out was suddenly apologizing in front of the entire team. That kind of whiplash doesn't happen naturally. It happens when forces outside the locker room decide they've had enough. But while the apology was public, the real story is what Stefanski went through privately the night before, because insiders say he was scrambling to figure out how to survive. For Kevin Stefanski, the apology may have looked simple on the surface, but behind it was a man trapped in the hardest decision of his career. This is a coach who built his reputation on being meticulous, disciplined, and in control. From his early days at Northwestern to his rise with the Vikings, he was known as the guy who stuck to the system no matter what. Cleveland hired him because of that steadiness, and for a while, it worked. Playoff appearances, Coach of the Year buzz, stability in a franchise that had known nothing but chaos. But Sanders changed everything. Suddenly, Stefanski's carefully built culture was being overshadowed by a rookie quarterback who wasn't just talented, he was a media magnet, an ownership obsession, and the centerpiece of every conversation in Cleveland. Sources say that on the night before the apology, Stefanski was scrambling. He allegedly reached out to confidants around the league. Former Vikings coach Mike Zimmer reportedly told him to accept reality, protect his job, and try to rebuild trust later. Sean McVay, on the other hand, reminded him that in today's NFL, the coach and quarterback have to be aligned, whether you like it or not. And Bill Belichick? True to form, he offered only 3 words: do your job.
That's the kind of advice Stefanski was weighing as the walls closed in. On one side, his pride and his principles. On the other, ownership's ultimatum and the threat of losing everything he'd worked for. By the time he walked into that locker room, Stefanski wasn't apologizing out of personal conviction. He was apologizing because survival demanded it. But while the coach was struggling to adapt, Sanders was taking a completely different approach, one that shocked even his own teammates. While Stefanski wrestled with pride, survival, and ownership pressure, Sanders was playing a completely different game. Instead of firing back in interviews or leaking frustrations through the media, he stayed calm. Teammates say he never once publicly criticized the coaching staff, even when it was obvious Gabriel was being favored. That restraint wasn't accidental. Sources close to the team suggest his father's influence played a huge role. Deion Sanders, no stranger to media storms, reportedly advised his son to stay patient and let the situation unfold naturally. The younger Sanders took that to heart, staying measured, choosing his words carefully, and letting the pressure build on Stefanski without ever having to throw the first punch. In the locker room, teammates noticed. They saw a rookie who wasn't rattled, who didn't sulk, and who carried himself like he already understood the bigger picture. He told some of them privately that he expected resistance, that adversity was part of the process, and that eventually his talent would make the decision undeniable. That's why the apology shocked him more than anyone else. Sanders had mentally prepared for a season-long battle, ready to prove himself one rep at a time. Instead, in one morning, the fight was over. But the sudden shift came with a price. The Browns weren't just changing who their quarterback was, they were about to tear up their entire game plan hours before kickoff. The apology might have settled the drama for the cameras, but on the field, it unleashed pure chaos. Within hours, Cleveland's entire offensive plan was ripped apart. Everything they had installed for Dylan Gabriel, the short, precise passing, the timing-based schemes, was scrapped. Coaches were suddenly tasked with building a game plan around Sanders' unique skill set, and they had less than a day to do it. Playbooks were rewritten, offensive linemen were being drilled on brand new protection calls they hadn't practiced all week. Receivers were told to adjust to deeper routes and improvisation-heavy plays. Even the audible system had to be simplified on the fly because Sanders hadn't had the time to master all the checks. One assistant coach reportedly described the morning as organized panic. Position groups were pulled aside one after another to rehearse entirely new concepts that should have taken weeks to install. Normally, that kind of scramble guarantees disaster. Confusion leads to mistakes, and mistakes get punished quickly in the NFL. But with Sanders, things aren't so simple. His mobility, his arm strength, and his fearlessness give him the ability to turn broken plays into highlight moments.
So the Browns entered the most important divisional matchup of their season armed with a game plan that was half-baked, a roster that was half-prepared, and a quarterback who might just be talented enough to make it all work. But while the coaches scrambled, the players in the locker room were left to process what all of this really meant, and not everyone was happy about it. Inside the Browns locker room, the apology didn't just shift the depth chart, it split the room. Some veterans embraced the change immediately. Nick Chubb, fighting his way back from a devastating injury, reportedly stood up in a team meeting and told Sanders he believed in him. Myles Garrett gathered the defense privately and reminded them that no matter the drama, their job was the same: dominate on Sunday. For younger players especially, that kind of leadership was enough to calm nerves. But not everyone was sold. Joel Bitonio, the longest tenured Brown, allegedly expressed frustration with how ownership had handled the situation. To him, years of carefully built culture had just been overturned in a single phone call from above. And he wasn't alone. Whispers from assistant coaches suggested some staff members feared this set a dangerous precedent. If ownership could dictate the quarterback, what else might they start controlling? The divide was clear. Some players saw Sanders as the spark Cleveland needed. Others saw him as the symbol of organizational chaos, a reminder that stability in this franchise never lasts. That tension didn't disappear after the apology. It lingered in the hallways, in film sessions, in the weight room, and whether the Browns admitted it or not, they were stepping onto the field carrying more than just a game plan. They were carrying the weight of an identity crisis. But the locker room wasn't the only place feeling the strain. Behind the scenes, the front office was watching the fallout with growing concern, because for them, this wasn't just about football, it was about credibility. If the locker room was divided, the front office was even more unsettled. General Manager Andrew Berry had invested heavily in both quarterbacks, hoping competition would play out naturally across the season. To him, this wasn't just about who started week one. It was about protecting assets, maximizing value, and letting performance decide the future. But when Jimmy Haslam forced the reconciliation and fast-tracked Sanders into the starting role, Berry's plan was shredded overnight. Insiders say he privately viewed the apology as a necessary evil, a short-term fix to stop the bleeding, but a move that could carry long-term damage. The optics were brutal. Around the league, other executives started questioning whether Berry had any real control in Cleveland. Was he building the roster, or was he just carrying out ownership's marching orders? In a profession built on reputation, that perception alone can be devastating. Even inside the organization, trust started to fracture. Scouts and personnel staff who had pushed hard for Gabriel reportedly felt sidelined. Analysts who had spent months modeling scenarios suddenly had to rewrite projections. The message was clear. In Cleveland, football decisions could be overturned with a single phone call from above. For Berry, the fallout wasn't just about Sanders or Stefanski. It was about his credibility, his influence, and his future. And the more people realized ownership had its fingerprints all over this apology, the more the story shifted away from football and towards something bigger. An organizational power struggle being played out in public. But while the front office quietly scrambled, the outside world was doing the exact opposite. The media, the fans, and even rival teams were watching with wide eyes as Cleveland's dysfunction turned into must-see entertainment. The moment news of Stefanski's apology leaked, the story stopped belonging to the Browns. It became a national spectacle. ESPN shifted its morning shows to live coverage outside the Browns' facility. Fox and CBS scrambled to rewrite their pregame rundowns, knowing millions of viewers would tune in for the drama. Headlines weren't about X's and O's anymore. They were about betrayal, reconciliation, and a quarterback battle turned soap opera. Social media exploded. The hashtags Free Sanders and hashtag Fire Stefanski trended for hours, with fans dissecting every rumor, every leak, every sideline glance. TikTok edits, Twitter threads, Instagram reels. The story spread like wildfire, feeding on the controversy. Even rival fan bases jumped in, mocking Cleveland for once again becoming the NFL's chaos capital. But inside the Browns' own fan base, the reactions were far more complicated. Some celebrated the apology, convinced this was finally the dawn of a new era with a quarterback worth believing in. Others rolled their eyes, calling it just another chapter in Cleveland's endless cycle of dysfunction. Ticket holders who had threatened to cancel suddenly started rethinking. Merch sales spiked overnight, with Sanders jerseys flying off the shelves. Parking lots around the stadium buzzed with heated debates. Was this apology the start of something real, or just another short-term fix designed to buy time? And through it all, rival teams were watching too. Scouts, coaches, even front offices across the league studied Cleveland's chaos, knowing it might set a precedent for how ownership power plays out in the modern NFL. The Browns had become the main character of the league, for better or worse. But underneath all the noise, one question loomed larger than everything else. Did any of this matter if Sanders couldn't deliver on the field? Because at the end of the day, all the apologies, hashtags, and headlines would come down to a single performance. Step back for a moment, and you realize Cleveland's situation isn't just another quarterback controversy. It's part of a much larger story about power, timing, and survival in the NFL. History is filled with examples of teams torn apart by ownership meddling or quarterback drama. The 1987 Buccaneers benched Steve Young under pressure from above, destroying their locker room and sending Young to San Francisco, where he became a Hall of Famer. The 2012 Jets turned their season into a circus with the Tim Tebow, Mark Sanchez fiasco, a distraction they never recovered from. Even the 49ers just a few years ago had to carefully navigate the Trey Lance, Jimmy Garoppolo situation, one that could have easily imploded their season if the front office hadn't been aligned. Cleveland now stands somewhere between all three of those cases, with the talent, the dysfunction, and the stakes cranked up higher than ever.